You know, I'm actually sad to be making this video. Dawntrail Savage Raid series has concluded with Arcadion Heavyweight, and I'm a bit upset that we won't get to see more of it. It did so much right as an overall raid series and was such a marked improvement from many of the design decisions players loathed in Endwalker that I think it deserves to be lauded as a success overall. I've enjoyed my time with it, but how did the final tier hold up to criticism, especially considering it released in direct succession to the gold standard Cruiserweight Savage? Do the 4 new fights excel, or are they a bit lukewarm? Let's talk about it all in detail. I'll be discussing each encounter separately first, and then later on in the video sharing some overall tier impressions, as well as Arcadion Raid thoughts. Vamp Fatale is the introduction to the tier, and its normal mode offered a tantalizing glimpse into what could be a fast-paced chaotic savage variant. I was anticipating par for the course from normal turns, lots of stacks, spreads, and pairs. Simple upgrades from normal mode that complexify how you solve mechanics, with the actual execution still being easy, and I was also expecting the ether-letting boss stacks to play quite a large role in her mechanics. Like, she'd gain and lose stacks periodically, and those would alter how specific telegraphs worked. That's not really what we got at all in the end, surprisingly. Vamp Fatale opens with the same bat mechanic that's present in normal mode, a rotating ring expanding out around the arena, with AoEs exploding when they touch a bat. The twist on this concept is that players are also acting as bats, and when they pop, they too will explode. There's no teamwork involved. It's fully a solo mechanic that verges on PvP when multiple players try to dip into the center at once without positioning well. This sets the scene well for what's to come throughout the rest of the fight. Instead of a test of your coordination, there are actually relatively few challenges that have you interacting with other players. For most of M9S's runtime, you are receiving a debuff or icon, dealing with it yourself, and moving on. And if you succeed or fail, only 2 people are severely punished: yourself and your healer, who has to deal with a dot or raise. If we run through the fight, both of the smaller platform phases are almost entirely just solo mechanics. The rotating bats with sanguine scratches are solo mechanics. The left-right dodges are solo mechanics. Plus, the bat mechanic I mentioned already pops up 3 different times, and that too is a solo mechanic. The only real points of coordination I can think of off the top of my head are the jail phase, which comes with spreads and stacks, and you could argue ether-letting because the puddles become sketchy very quickly if some people don't follow the agreed plan. Everything you're presented with is varied and immediately solvable, but fun to do. It's a bit like an obstacle course out of something like Takeshi's Castle. Nothing is supposed to be lingered on for too long, but powered through whilst getting the blood pumping. If this is a design archetype that they'll keep for future first turns, if I'm going to be 100% honest, I'm all for it. It's a good way to get new players into Savage raiding in a comparatively safe environment that doesn't put their failures whilst learning under a microscope. It shows what can be enjoyable about overcoming those trial and errors in a bit of a microcosm. Faster, less punishing, easier to overcome. Then you move on to the 2nd, 3rd and 4th turns and get those more challenging long-term hurdles. I'm pondering this just because Vamp Fatale feels so drastically different to Dancing Green. The latter was way more challenging and focused more on party members interacting with one another for pairs and stacks. It kept that sense of each component being immediately easy to understand. That's a through line between both of them and Black Cat as well, but the collaborative expectation has been reduced in Heavyweight's offering. What results is, honestly, the easiest first turn encounter of the entire expansion. It's fast to progress, lacks a tight check so the clear follows shortly after, and I anticipate it's going to be very smooth to re-clear even for Party Finder. Just over halfway through, the 2nd small platform phase will occur where players will need to soak tank buster towers and destroy tools before they enrage whilst avoiding saws and drills as they make mincemeat of the platform and anybody foolish enough to remain in their path for too long. This whole mechanic is super Honeybee Lovely coded. You know that phase halfway through M2S where the bees just shoot line AoEs? Whilst you could formulate a strat to mitigate the personal responsibility and lower the RNG, the best solution in general was to cite the old mantra of just dodge, forehead. This gives me the same feeling. It's chaotic, and rules or planning both somewhat fall flat in favour of just using your eyes and reacting quickly. I see that as a positive. Not everything needs to be memorization or some intricate dance. I also do have to say the Party Finder Aether-letting strat is criminally strong. That mechanic might as well not exist to 99% of the player base, and I somewhat appreciate that somebody was able to sit there and figure out the angles to make it work. My expectation was that they'd be dropped in such a way that you'd be able to just always rotate counterclockwise or clockwise in between each hit and end up in a nice convenient safe line. But literally just being able to spread out, drop your puddle, and then stand in the middle whilst everything resolves around you feels like something the development team could never have anticipated. I do wonder if that mechanic was intended to be one of the major stumbling blocks for players and that the prevalence of this strategy has neutered it entirely. Vamp's primary form of punishment is interesting too. We've seen a few times throughout FF14's history bosses that punish you for dying or failing mechanics by giving the boss a permanent increase in challenge for the rest of the attempt. A7S all the way back in Heavensward is a good example, with your foe getting an endless damage boost if somebody dies. In the case of M9S, her stacks will increase periodically with a natural completion of mechanics, but the process can be expedited with mechanical failures from the party. This can lead to her left-right half-room dodges, as well as her hardcore tank busters increasing in size early. I really appreciate this concept, though I somewhat wish it had been expanded on to more components. Maybe Sanguine Scratch cleaves could work differently depending on how many stacks she has. Maybe she gets more tools with more stacks on the small arena. Stuff like that would be interesting to see. You're punished for failure, but you can still overcome. So to summarise my feelings on M9, it's simple but fun. Definitely the easiest of the first turns we've got on all expansion, though I say that not as a negative but as colour commentary in the differing style of challenge it offers. Maybe that style is healthy going forward for first turns of Savage. I'm pretty open to seeing how it plays out if that's the direction Square Enix wish to take us in. There are a couple of interesting parts I like, though it's not an insanely imaginative encounter by any stretch of the imagination. It's simple, and it does that simple concept well. M10 was the fight I was most excited about coming out of normal. Sugar Riot was a very experimental entry, and to me, an absolutely roaring success. The ad phase at the midpoint of the fight tested abilities not required in FF14 raiding for many years at this point, and pieced together an intricate puzzle where your damage prioritization was the main resource. It was cool as hell, and it set the standard for what I considered to be an interesting second turn. Heavyweight's entry had a lot to live up to, and its normal mode promised a wealth of potential. Two foes both leaping in and out of the action and around the arena and at times challenging you together. It created the potential for interesting cleave scenarios that would allow other jobs to shine and let players have a little more nuance to their rotation than only thinking about single target and nothing else. The fact that in normal mode, you reduced your own arena space and got to pick your poison on which zones you walled yourself off from too was really exciting in theory, and I was interested to see how they'd expand upon both in Savage. Or if they did at all, really. If they did, it could be a damn good fight. Turns out, those hopes came true in interesting ways. M10S does have really interesting optimization potential. During the first two phases, you are fighting the Xtremes each individually, and it's like any other FF14 fight. But from the point that they both enter the arena together onwards, you have a constantly different priority. Sometimes both are targetable and stackable, leading to easy cleave, and some jobs utilising their AoE combos. But at times, one will either be jumping all over the place or completely untargetable. Those free cleave situations are few and far between, though a competent pair of tanks can increase their volume drastically for a GCD or two here and there. More than that, it increases the value of jobs that are able to cleave two targets that are a bit further away from one another without impeding their standard combos like Red Mage and Dragoon. In fact, those two jobs, alongside Pictomancer, are the heavy hitters in M10S, rocking peaks of damage values despite not being amongst the top 3 in any other encounters this tier as of yet. I think shifts in top performers like this due to fight design are really healthy and encourage more use of the armory system, just like when AoE jobs shined in M6S, with Viper being a key example. It's healthy for different jobs to have different strengths, and the game's content to allow people to showcase those strengths. It's a huge win for the experimental second turn yet again. I do think they pulled off a 2-phase boss fight well, too. I was concerned we'd see some kind of firewall, like the one you get in the Omega Raid series, and in all honesty, something that seems to happen constantly when we're giving a taste of potential 2-target boss fights. It reduces an exciting new proposition to the same old paradigm, so I'm heartened to see they actually committed to it in Heavyweight. Maybe this is a step towards us finally getting our first real council fight raid since Heavensward. Who knows? I think with how much Square Enix have improved at encounter design since then, they have the potential to piece something really exciting together. And if they did, the experimental second turn is quite likely where it would lie. That idea really excites me. It's also cool that the second turn has become the experimental raid, and yet M6S and M10S are totally different beasts. They are not alike whatsoever. Completely different directions, and I think that's amazing. I want to look at a certain moment in the midpoint of the fight that really stands out to me as making an interesting mechanic that plays into the battle's key thematics. Fire leaves puddles on the floor. Water will detonate those puddles in a steam explosion. Then, when both are targetable at once, you get this intricate little puzzle where Deep Blue and Red Hot are each executing their attacks at once, and your challenge isn't just to avoid them, but to do so whilst making enough space to not inhibit your survival later on. This entire mechanic can be a cakewalk or a nightmare based entirely on how carefully you position those fire puddles, and it gives you both ample choice and a direct feeling of improvement when you learn how to place them safely. I really like mechanics that don't have one clear intended solution, but they instead just let you be a little more creative. This one is designed so well as well. It feels good to execute, and you could probably make 10 different working strats that would all have their unique upsides and downsides. Just like M9S, it's super varied as well, and not very punishing. It's like, instead of taking a core mechanical concept and expanding on that for the entire fight runtime, as they have done many times in the past, instead, they've taken the thematic concepts of those Arcadion fighters and made a varied battle based on those, letting the mechanics with that theme be a little more spread and free-flowing in specifics. We go from solo fights, to duo fights, to surfboards, to ultimate-esque trio puzzles, to stretchy tether match the colour orb jails, all just a few minutes apart. Nothing is allowed to fall into the realm of habit too easily, and that's a good thing. I do have 2 decisions that puzzled me a little though. Firstly is that the fire and water steam explosions are so superfluous to the overall encounter. I had expected them to be M10S's primary form of punishment for poor AoE placement, and that putting multiple steam explosions together in the same spot would either cause a huge raid wide, or for them to merge and increase in size, creating these big failure states. But that never happened. Really, they function more as a minor annoyance than any meaningful addition. They don't matter. The second was that puzzle near the end of the fight, where the arena is split in half and players will need to place puddles, pair stacks and bait Deep Blue cleaves, whilst being either close or far to the boss. Once you get a feel for it, this mechanic is totally fine to deal with, even as the far side, which it's fair to say is the quote-unquote hard side of the setup. With that said, the lines on the floor feel quite weak for this mechanic. Usually in FF14 you can rely on the lines on the floor to be clear and ample for any tight positioning mechanic, but in this case a mixture of the colours of the ground plus the visual tells, and the rather weak lines even in the first place, make seeing where to go a nightmare. Reminds me a little bit of the complaints players had with P3S back in Endwalker, honestly. In Party Finder this mechanic is really inconsistent, with all the players that don't quite exactly know where to stand and have no visual reference in order to get to their spot. Overall, M10S is a triumph. Another win to cement the second turn propaganda. Sugar Riot and the Xtremes both cut hard. In my opinion, it's an S tier fight and my second favourite of the tier, easily slotting itself into the top third of battles in Dawntrail's entire expansion. I'm a big fan and I can't wait to see what they do with second turns in 8.0. M11S sees you face off against the champion of the Arcadion, the Tyrant. Its normal mode was, in all honesty, lacking. The most third turn of third turns ever. Ins, outs, and plus telegraphs that get spammed again and again, and despite having a couple of memorable highlight moments like where he grabs half of the arena and uses it as a club to smash the remaining half with, but that still isn't enough to make it feel particularly interesting. More than anything, it gave me a sense of trepidation. One of two things would be true. This would be a classically designed third turn Savage, which I mean as a derogatory, or they were hiding a lot from the normal mode, which would render the higher difficulty an entirely different beast. Unfortunately, it turned out to be a little bit of both. The first section of the encounter disappointed me. It is completely devoid of imaginative design, to the point that when my group was preparing for it, we close to correctly identified what every mechanic up until and including the tornadoes almost halfway through would do. We just chose the most predictable options that seemed kind of third turny and they just worked. Third turns often fall into this trap. They overuse the stack, spread, pairs or light parties, but with a twist concept, and have all of them with visual tells, and big swathes of the fight ends up just being understand and react to the stimuli. Don't worry, it's going to hit hard and or fast. In the case of M11S, it does both. It's blindingly fast for Savage, and some patterns are pretty rough for casters that end up on the far side of the arrangement, and putting together a plan that allows you uptime on every permutation of these weapon barrages is pretty enjoyable to do. On the plus side, it doesn't fall into the most egregious part of the third turn trap. These mechanics stop early in the fight at the very least, and they don't just magically reappear at the tail end like some shambling zombie of a final challenge. I would have hated it if they did that. It ruined fights like Fatebreaker for me. With that negativity aside, the second half of the encounter is much better. Meteor Rain into Arena Split into that mechanic I don't remember the name of, with the Fire Puddle baits into towers and then the Portal Beam tethers. Each of these are varied, fun to do, and challenging enough to feel like they fit the tail end of a Savage tier. Orbital is really fun to execute too. Just a literal, fast, simple, get good dodge. There are patterns you can recognise to make it easier on yourself, but nothing really holds up quite as well as fast, confident dodging. I like that about it. Not everything needs to be some complex, multi-layered puzzle that bends your brain and makes you rethink everything. Sometimes it can be as simple as dodge AoE fast, as long as it feels new or packaged in a new way. That's all that matters. I've also very much enjoyed M11S as a healer. I feel like I really needed to line up my mitigation and GCD healing well in a week 1 scenario, and it was a surprise to me to feel tested before a final turn in this respect. A positive one, that is. Whilst there are rarely situations in which the raid wides hit back to back in a very punishing way aside from during weapons, the individual raid wide values themselves are very high. This fight has clearly become the PF wall of the tier. Not because its mechanics are difficult, or because it's punishing, but because it has a moderate DPS check. It isn't super tight by any means, to make it clear, but I can see the situation arising where a couple of substandard players in the party can quickly morph it into clean run territory to attain a clear. It's a big execution fight. Easy puzzles, fast mechanics, high damage. Anecdotally, I find that this style of design is the one party finder struggles with the most, as there will often be at least 1 or 2 players that are quite weak at actual execution or their rotations, even if they do study and understand the mechanics. Because a death doesn't usually spell a wipe, these doomed attempts can overstay their welcome and lead to frustration as they hit the wall again and again. Overall, I think M11S is okay. Definitely the weakest entry in the heavyweight tier, and I was very disappointed in the final phase. Luckily, it's fun enough to actually do, and the second half and damage output make up for it and leave it in a place where I don't dread it in my weekly reclears. My major gripe, I think, is that it's still stuck in that third turn design philosophy that I personally just don't really enjoy. I hope Square Enix is able to breathe new life into them next expansion. If they are supposed to be the execution fights of their respective tiers, that's fine, but maybe they can get a lick of paint to make them feel a little more fresh. M12 is the final confrontation against Lindwurm, and this too had a fairly lacking normal mode. It definitely felt like they were keeping their cards close to their chests, though this was somewhat more expected than it would have been in the case of a third turn. If we think back to Abyssos, the normal mode of that was kind of a nothing fight, whereas Savage held a lot, including an entire second phase. Lindwurm normal was similar. The main prediction and hope I had was for something built around Cruel Coil, in which you'd be periodically dipping in and out of the coil in spreads or pairs, and we also tested if the final crunch at the end of it all was immediately lethal or could be survived. Turns out that you can survive it with mitigation as a tank, and we somewhat foolishly believed that it could turn out to be a valuable piece of information that might give us an edge coming into 12 Savage. I think it's important to preface this video with the fact that if you didn't already know, M12S is a two-phase encounter with a checkpoint in between. 2 fights for all intents and purposes. This is the first one in dawntrail, funnily enough, after both Howling Blade and Wicked Thunder were singular long-form encounters with transitions halfway through. Personally, I've always been fond of us getting a mixture of both door bosses and singular fights throughout an expansion, and I think that Shadowbringers did this idea best. Dawntrail now apes that Shadowbringers format 1-for-1, so yeah, I'm a fan of the fact that we are getting a door boss this time around. The benefits of door bosses are twofold. Firstly, you get to design 2 fights that are very distinctly different from one another, and secondly, you get to fine-tune the difficulty of each with far more leniency. You can put hard mechanics later in the fights because they're short. You can stack trios back to back and get a little experimental. I think it's freeing for the developers in a way. The first phase is really enjoyable. It hits like a truck, firstly, with raid wides that are reminiscent of the high damage values present in Shiva Savage, that will just decimate a raid if they aren't properly prepared. I've always been a big critic of FF14 healing profiles, and I'm really happy to say that in both Cruiserweight and Heavyweight there's been a very marked improvement over both Light Heavyweight and a lot of Endwalker. I've been having a lot of fun healing this raid tier, and whilst I know it'll quickly become habit after a couple of weeks, this kind of experience is one I'm very thankful to have. Healers have more tools than ever, and it can be difficult to tune fights in such a way that they feel they have to use their kits efficiently. It's a bit of a conundrum, I think, but the execution here is really great. There are a lot of intuitive mechanics in this fight. Many of the grotesquerie puzzles are fairly straightforward to understand, and will just be a case of smart party positioning. They're easy to learn, but fast in execution, and that's where the challenge is intended to lie. Honestly, this entire door boss is quite easy. Compare it to Athena, for example, and Lindwurm is drastically simpler to break through. I also feel that I need to mention Cruel Coil here. Whatever I expected, I did not anticipate it almost being a 1-for-1 rip-off of Looper from the Omega Protocol. The mechanic resolution orders are identical, and if you change the words snap tethers with grab tethers, you could probably explain Cruel Coil to somebody and they would be able to execute Looper. It's that similar. I don't hate the idea of repurposing ultimate mechanics an expansion or 2 later and bringing them forward into lower difficulty content. This isn't the first time that shift has occurred, and I've never seen it executed in a blatant enough way to be frustrating, but it is funny to see that close connection. Really, M12's door boss is just a simple, good FF14 raid. It does everything right, but doesn't really have any crazy wow moments that allow it to stand on its own. But then, you beat the check. Watch the transition to phase 2, and the music hits, because god damn this final phase is truly special. First off, the music. You might have heard a little snippet during the final Arcadion cutscenes, but here it's on full display in all its glory. This epic, lovely medley containing many of the major motifs of the Arcadion fighters. It's fitting for a final battle, and it stands alongside what I think might just be the coolest and most epic final raid series themes of all. being the one that accompanies Final Omega. I'm a sucker for a final phase with a good backing track, and this hits hard. The first half of the fight is really fun as well. The key motifs of the battle are boss replication, where he will create clones of himself that either duplicate his own mechanics or add their own to the mix. And then to complicate matters further, they too will split, and to quickly create an overwhelming mess to deal with. The second is staging, in which copies of the 8 raid members in the duty will be created, and players will get the option to tether to them and assign particular mechanics to both themselves and to their copies. These aren't two separate factors either. Replications and staging copies start intertwining with one another as soon as the second major mechanic of the fight, and from that point onwards they only delve deeper into the concept. Lindwurm uses both of these to create some really cool puzzles that are fun to solve and execute. The first just uses his clones to attack players and force debuffs on them, which then forces the party to find the clones that haven't attacked at this point as they split and leap around the arena, weaving amongst cleaves to find the correct spot in which to get attacked by the one hit that won't kill them. But the first staging is where liking M12S quickly shifted into love. You get to choose which players and resultingly which clones will deal with deformations, stacks and cleaves, as well as who will bait attacks from the boss. It's the perfect type of puzzle because it has multiple solving methods, tickles your brain just enough to be neither immediately solvable nor too finicky to become frustrating, and even after figuring it out, it's very satisfying to actually do. Genuinely just great fun. But I think everybody knows what I'm going to talk about next. The second half of the encounter, which is taken up by one single mechanic. Idyllic Dream. To say it bluntly, stuff like this is the reason I'm still playing FF14 after 11 years. Genuinely. Moments that wow you because of how imaginative and out of left field they are, even after literally hundreds of raids and trials. It's bloody peak. To give you an idea of the mechanic, I am going to just sit here and spend a few minutes explaining the steps at a very surface level for you. Staging will cast first, and it'll spawn 8 player clones and tether you. Remember if the 4 spawned cardinal or intercardinal. A replication casts, spawning 3 clones. Remember the safe spots and which clones did which attacks. Then more replication and more clones. Remember which mechanic your clone telegraphs, and each player will choose which mechanic they'll deal with later. Those AoE telegraphs from earlier will come into play now. Dodge them, the arena will change and 4 towers will spawn. These towers are not real, yet. You just need to remember which one you have and which mechanic it deals. 4 players will be hit by holy AoEs. These players cannot take specific towers, so they may have to swap with their partners and remember these new towers instead. Next, the arena will change back. The tells from earlier will go off next in the same order they spawned. Then the arena changes back again to towers, and the towers go off and you must deal with those mechanics. Then Lindwurm's 3 clones from like 2.5 minutes ago come back into play. They're just sat here after all this. He's going to suck one of them into a black hole to delay its attacks till later, and you must remember which one it is, whilst dealing with deformations and stacks that are going off from the staging clones at last, as Lindwurm throws those clones into the arena one by one to finally execute their attacks 3 minutes later, and you need to remember both the timing of those cleaves and the positioning of those stacks whilst avoiding the deformations. All of this takes place over about 4 minutes. One single mechanic, multi-layered stacks of memory and telegraphs and different minigames beneath the surface level of this overall challenge. It's bloody nuts, and yet it's not out of place. It doesn't feel unfair or too much, it's perfect. You feel good when you solve it. Its execution isn't crazy, but it's still fun to do. I almost can't believe that they had the balls to devote half of the fight to this one mechanic, and then the sauce to pull it all off cleanly. I do think it's fair to argue that, this is probably a remnant from the Future's rewritten cutting room floor, right? Some kind of scrapped mechanic that didn't make it into December 2024's release for whatever reason, be it timing limitations, or that they didn't want to make the ultimate too hard by stacking it right next to crystallized time. I've always been quite disappointed in Fru's handling of Phase 3 against the Oracle of Darkness, as it felt more like Savage Plus than a full-on repurposed Ultimate Phase. And yet this one, thematically, could slot naturally into that fight with little more than a reskin. The towers use the light and dark elements primarily, alongside fire, wind, earth and thunder, all elements that could easily be attributed to the arbiters of the elements in the Eden Raid series. They have these boss clones that look like legally distinct Eden's Promise ads, though really you could also imagine them co-opting Rinon and Gaia popping in and out of these portals, and visually it would fit perfectly. It's a mechanic revolving around memory and the passing of time, using what are essentially rewinds linked to copies of the players as the linchpin of their mechanic resolutions. Everything just fits. Part of me would love to see confirmation or rejection on this idea one day from the developers themselves, just because it's really interesting. I want this kind of FF14, the creative kind that pushes the limits and tries new things with every raid tier, the kind that isn't afraid to fail knowing that what they've released will at least take people by surprise, the kind that is always pushing forward boldly rather than playing it safe and boring. Idyllic Dream and M12S as an entirety is brilliant. The only downside I can really say about it is that it's likely going to be fairly uninteresting to reclear. But you know what? I don't care. The way it made me feel that first time through surpasses everything else. I guess I want to leave you with some final thoughts on the Arcadion, seeing as it's over and done with now. First of all, the Arcadion might go down as the best FF14 raid series to date. If it doesn't, it's up there for sure. It has some absolute banger final turns, revolutionized the second floor design and made them something players are excited for, and nailed the themings and characterizations of the battles more so than any raid before has, and it isn't even close. They put fun and free-flowing design with the intent of making it memorable above anything else. Heavyweight was a good send-off to the Arcadion, I think. The ending it deserved. I'm sad it's over, because whatever comes next is going to have a hard job living up to this. In my opinion, the Arcadion is the absolute highlight of dawntrail. Nothing else has even come close to comparing, in my estimation. With that said, I still think they're a little lost when it comes to third turns. I haven't loved Brute Bomber, Abominator, or the Tyrant. To me, they've all been fairly middling. I think this current trend has stuck since all the way back in Shadowbringers, starting with Leviathan. Third turns are clearly built to be these fun execution checks that rely on taking visual cues and acting on them quickly, with 2 or so major mechanics that act as puzzles to break up that flow. But this format is old and tiring. It isn't particularly fun when you know that's what you're going to get without fail every single time. Just as in dawntrail they reinvigorated the second turn, in 8.0 I'd like to see them really reevaluate how they designed third turns. Square Enix can cook, and I want to see what they serve up. I do feel that the team has taken on board a lot of the feedback they received after both Shadowbringers and Endwalker when it comes to raid. This is a marked improvement. Hitbox sizes and boss movement have gotten a lot better, as have healing profiles. Fights do feel more varied and less formulaic as a collective. There is less fear in allowing people to run into any friction when it comes to being able to hit the boss. They've let you work for it a lot more this expansion. These were all key points of feedback by the player base, and all of these have been rectified in what is a huge win to me. If I'm being so real, if Jobs got this level of love, FF14 might well just be my perfect game. I'm so happy I get to be so positive about this raid series. Please, continue to smash it out of the park, Square Enix. The Arcadion was a marvel, and I look forward to seeing new raids more than anything else in this game. More than anything else in gaming, even. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please do consider supporting my Patreon or becoming a YouTube member like these fine folks. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.